It's questionable to what extent the state or any other actors are free to intervene decisively in the evolution of what de Swan has described as the world language system, and in particular those languages which he variously describes as central, supercentral or hypercentral, which tie together the various linguistic collectivities across the globe. The tipping points and the snowballing effects that confirm one language as dominant and another as unsustainable in its former role follow a probabilistic arithmetic in which conventionally understood language policies have for the most part a rather marginal role. However, as we all know, languages are not simply neutral codes. They carry with them potential for alliances, estrangements, and semantic orientation, and nations are understandably reluctant to let these wither when they're seen as assets. Accordingly, there's currently quite an acute competition among those languages of the world with some claim to having a global role beyond national front borders. Even if each would like to present itself as a global public good, non-excludable, non-divisible, they're still competing for the scarce resource of human attention. And the very fact that English, just in the last 3 decades or so, has reached a position of apparently unassailable dominance has cast into particular relief the attempts to justify the promotion of other languages. I've been studying one pocket of that justificatory activity concerning those charged within France with securing the language's sustainability as a world language. This activity will certainly have taken on a different shape in, say, the Hispanophone, the Sinophone, the Lusophone, or Arabophone worlds. I've been working primarily on the rhetoric used within public policy contexts, and I've noticed a key shift in the terms of justification deployed by the language's would-be promoters. They can no longer rely on the unspoken aura or prestige of the language from the days when it was, if not a global power, then a global cultural magnetic north. Instead, and this is where we approach the terms of our current virtual conference, they must explicate why it might be for its future speakers a resource that is both useful and emancipatory. But this does not seem to me to be an altogether self-evident case to make. So for my purposes today, I'd like to step aside from the public policy context I've been looking at and to consider some philosophical and or theoretical attempts to elucidate the relations between global lingua francas in their singularity or plurality on the one hand, and domination and freedom on the other. I'll begin discussing Philippe van Parijs's arguments, the causes of global distributive justice and the augmentation of real freedoms are best served not by resisting, but by accelerating the spread of English as the world's sole lingua franca. The arguments are, in my view, forceful and may perhaps force me in turn to move beyond a well-meaning invocation of linguistic diversity as some kind of good in its own right. I'll then proceed to examine a number of French treatments of these themes. I'll begin to end with 2 critical probes by Michel de Certeau and Pascal Casanova into the epoch when French itself, often in the name of emancipation, aspired to the status of universal world language. In between those, I'll evoke 2 rather different endeavors by Derrida and Kristeva to capture some of the complexity carried by French as a vehicular language, a historical knot of post-colonial ambition and emancipatory effect, a medium of autonomy and heteronomy. And I'll close by returning to Van Parijs's case that global justice and real freedom require a single global lingua franca, and asking whether that should be the last word on the subject. For Van Parijs, the path towards maximum global justice and real freedoms would pass through the promotion of a single global lingua franca. Given the current dynamic of the world language system, this would need to be English. Near universal proficiency in this medium would give to as many people as possible more equalized access to the resources and opportunities they need to follow their notion of the good life. These real freedoms contrast, at least as I read him, with the more formal freedoms pursued by the champions of linguistic diversity and linguistic rights. In addition, for Van Parijs, a single shared language across the globe would create an ethical contagion through which the world's fortunate would be brought into more direct dialogue with the wretched of the earth. The most obvious objection to Van Parijs's argument is that the world is heading in this direction anyway, and that there's no need for any supplementary boost from a political philosopher to secure that outcome. Moreover, this dynamic is driven in large measure by economic forces that show little correlation with the equalization of real freedoms or even the spread of transcontinental empathy. However, his key point is that the best way to align this linguistic dynamic with the demands of global justice is to accelerate it rather than resist it. The more competence in international English becomes banal, the quicker the situational rent accruing to its native speakers will diminish, as will their capacity to impose their ideologically laden semantic frameworks upon the rest of the world. As non-native speakers grab the global megaphone and have access to the linguistic productions of others who have similarly grabbed it, the asymmetries currently marking the Anglosphere will become reduced. Indeed, over a substantial interim period, Van Parijs suggests that English native speakers' situational rent will flip into competitive disadvantage as they become the only monolinguals in a sea of bilinguals. There are at least three other ways of assuring the interlinguistic mediations required to hold the world language system together as a system. Van Parijs dismisses, for reasons I can't go into here due to time, two possible contenders: the introduction of a supposedly neutral artificial language along the lines of Esperanto, and the possibility of a purely technical works, a purely technical fix akin to the Babel fish familiar to adepts of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The other option in Van Parijs's account is the plural lingua franca regime. He notes that advocates of transnational languages that are not English tend for obvious reasons to support this. However, Van Parijs views this more or less as a non-starter on grounds of simple arithmetic implausibility. If a set of 6 countries, each with different native languages, collectively agree on a single lingua franca, any random grouping of, say, 5 speakers from among those countries will have a 100% probability of being able to communicate simultaneously in a single language. But if they opt for a modest plural lingua franca regime where all citizens learn one of 2 possible vehicular languages, those same random meetings of 5 speakers will have only a 0.26 chance of being able to communicate simultaneously. Of course, you could remedy that by forcing all citizens to learn 2 lingua francas, but this is a very significant burden for individual speakers and state budgets, and will open up ferocious competition for the status of second authorized lingua franca. One might imagine such a scenario within, say, the EU and its 27 members, which both Van Parijs and de Swan analyse in terms of a coexisting rhetorical commitment to multilingualism and a concomitant expansion in recourse to English. For Van Parijs, then, if you're for global justice and widely distributed real freedoms, then you must be for a global single lingua franca regime. This doesn't mean he believes the world as a whole should embrace a voluntaristic monolingualism. He sees it as unreasonable and quite impossible anyway to expect present generations in non-Anglophone countries to start raising their young as Anglophones. On the contrary, he defends the case for quite severe, territorially coercive linguistic laws at the level of institutions that would allow national or regional languages, should the relevant population wish, to remain queens within their frontiers. The purpose of such coercive laws would be to protect the opportunities and the real freedoms of the population from the remorseless laws of interlinguistic global competition, where interlocutory kindness and individual speakers' multilingualism are themselves the stepping stones for language erosion. These laws would protect a level of interterritorial diversity across the world, at least temporarily, though Van Parijs is rather grudging about this and insists it's a simple side effect of his argument from the requirements of real freedoms. However, at the level of global lingua franca, there is no such side effect in his argument. Diversity there brings only, in practicality, additional burdens and impediments to freedom. Van Parijs's arguments might seem to stop the promotion of an extraterritorial role for French or other languages dead in their tracks. However, one might wonder at the same time whether he does not have a somewhat thinly instrumental view of language and its relation to the subject. He says that were Italian finally to disappear from Italy, he would miss the charm that the local vernacular gives to local villages in Tuscany as much as the next person. But the very way in which he proffers the example makes you wonder if he would. We're a long way from Jacques Derrida's perhaps inversely hyperbolic insistence on what he calls the poetic economy of the idiom, the one that matters to me and without which I would die even more quickly. Or indeed, on how the subject's very own I and myself are bound together through different operations in different languages. Je me rappelle, je me souviens, I remember who I was, ich erinnere mich. French was once the internationally predominant language, but it is no longer. That trajectory is quite singular, and there's a rich seam of critical reflection within French that relates it to issues of domination and emancipation, autonomy and heteronomy. It's worth pausing to reflect on some fragments of this, to assess what might be lost with a skein that holds the linguistic collectivities of the world together to be formed of a single universal idiom. There's at least a formal resemblance between Van Parijs's programme to accelerate the universalisation of English and the efforts of revolutionaries such as Barrère and the Abbé Grégoire to accelerate the universalisation of French, initially within France. Grégoire's famous 1794 report to the National Convention was aptly entitled On the Necessity and Means of Annihilating Regional Dialects, anéantir les patois, and universalising the use of the French language. The motives justifying this programme were, as far as we can tell, clearly emancipatory. They wanted to give citizens access to more substantial freedoms, notably through educational materials, to free them from dependence on the interpretations of the world furnished by local notables, and to create something of the ethical contagion that might bring them to identify with the duties a republic would lay upon them. At the same time, of course, by eroding the linguistic autonomy, as it was called, of the regions, such programs would augment the reach and power of the central state. De Certeau revisits that historical moment 2 centuries later in his 1975 book, Une politique de la langue, la Révolution française et les patois. I think it's the only one of his books not to have been translated, actually. He focuses less on the discourses of the Parisian revolutionary elite and much more on the position of their correspondents in the provinces, who were asked in a preliminary survey of 1790 to report on the status and function of patois in their regions. Most inhabitants were reportedly unable to understand standard French. Whereas Grégoire was absolutely clear about his objectives, his bilingual correspondence revealed various degrees of ambivalence. We might, given the theme of our conference, put it in Kantian terms and say they were caught between the law of the Parisian programme, to which they wanted to show their adherence, and the nature or inclinations, Neigungen, vested in the patois of their native territory. Some are less confident than Grégoire in the clinical possibility of his operation. As the Society of Friends of the Constitution of Perpignan put it, to destroy patois, one would have to destroy the sun, the coolness of nights, our alimentary sustenance, the quality of the water, and indeed the man in his entirety. Certeau traces, and doubtless accentuates more than the correspondents themselves, how Grégoire's productivist insistence on an efficient central language lends an affective and even eroticized charge being attached to the backwards patois it is designed to efface and the life world they carry with them. Mutatis mutandis, one might wonder whether Van Parijs's paradoxically productivist insistence on English as the most efficient generator of justice and opportunity might set in motion a similar affective dynamic. Derrida writes in his Le monolinguisme de l'autre that he feels unable to address issues of language policy head-on, but his idiosyncratic, elliptical orbit around such issues is arguably as suggestive as any direct approach. He aspires, in an arguably mad fashion, as he confesses, to combine an account that is absolutely universal and absolutely personal or particular. Absolutely universal, he sets out a generative paradox. I only have one language, it isn't mine, and argues that it could be truly spoken by any speaking subject. But particular, this general law remarked itself across his existence in an absolutely singular fashion. And it's hard not to concede the force of this combination. He recollects memories of his upbringing and education as a Jew in Algiers. As far back as he could recall, he could speak only French. He had no discrete maternal language, and French was imposed at school. Various implicit or explicit interdictions impeded access to, say, Arabic, Hebrew, or Tamazight. And yet that French most emphatically was not his. Its norms, canons, and symbolic valorization came from across the sea, from the metropolitan centre. The French language was an acutely colonial enterprise. Derrida, in fact, argues that any language policy has a colonial dimension if one returns to the roots of the term, insofar as it seeks to plant its apparatus within a population. And yet he experienced it as the very vehicle of his emancipation or autonomy, and particularly in the initially disembodied literary and philosophical spheres which it opened up. Hence Derrida's acute problematization of his relation to the laws, the nomoi of this language. They are other, they're not his, and yet they are his. He wants them to be his. They're closer to him than himself. He coins the term autoheteronomy to capture the madness inherent in this law, the cycle of attachment and detachment it unleashes, how it appears to bind and to free. He notes ironically how, having devised a philosophical enterprise that undoes phantasms of purity, he remains incurably attached to a certain purity of the French language. He's embarrassed by his embarrassment at his own or others' lapses from this phantasmatic purity. He sees it as a point of honor to push what the poetic economy of the language can produce as far as he can, to demonstrate what even the most imaginative and painstaking translators will be unable to reproduce. Does that give us anything in our preliminary gatherings of our own doubts about the desirability of a single global lingua franca regime? It gives us a more searching account of what an attachment to a language or freedom through a language that is not one's own might look like than that provided by Van Parijs. It gives us a more probing notion of the complex resources embodied in the thick historical accretion of a language, and why making only one of those routinely available to world citizens might be problematic. This is my last slide. Julia Kristeva, in her 2009 report on the cultural message of France and the intercultural vocation of francophonie, observes repeatedly that the French have become inhibited about promoting their own language. Perhaps less inhibited herself in this regard because, like Derrida, she came to French from outside France, Bulgaria, not Algeria. She argues that they should proffer their language and culture to the world without a complex, but as long as it is proffered in its complexity, as a concerted grappling with a legacy of violence and domination, as much as with the emancipatory motifs with which these were interwoven. In accents reminiscent of Malraux, she argues that when France and the Francophone world stand up for the reach of their language, they stand up for the reach of international linguistic plurality as such. More than this, she argues that the experience of moving between languages is in itself a fundamental human experience that should be distributed as widely as possible. If this takes only ever the form of a movement between one's native language and the single global lingua franca, which Kristeva rather disparages as a purely instrumental globish, the opportunity for individuals to expand their freedoms as polyphonic subjects will be severely thinned out. For Kristeva, world language cultures are so many laboratories in which fundamental human questions beyond that of productivity are worked out and differently inflected. The open-ended, variegated unruliness of such a projected world is doubtless more wasteful from a certain point of view than the single lingua franca world elaborated by Van Parijs, where every language knows its place and every place confines its language. For many, however, it might look like a more attractive world for habitation and exploration. Pascal Casanova, in her final book, published in 2015, La langue mondiale, traduction et domination, argued that the functioning of a dominant world language corresponded to a transhistorical function across different world language systems. The function was once fulfilled by Latin, then French, now English. In a book that can hardly be taxed with the charge of linguistic chauvinism, Casanova traces in particular the effects on French thought of the language's dominance over other languages between the 17th and 19th centuries. It became impatient with the tasks of learning and absorbing other languages and their associated intricacies of meaning, and opted resolutely for, quote, heteronomous forms of translation, which subsumed foreign discourses under the familiarity of ready-made French generic templates and meanings. This had nothing to do, she argues, with any innate French character, but was simply a result of the language's position at the time within the international field of established languages. If the book reads rather like an allegorical treatment of the effects of English today, it's because the same structural dynamics are in play across an even more intensely competitive international force field. For those languages able to make their weight felt, one might conclude, it is important not to leave the world language of the contemporary historical moment free to impose its own categories and divisions. When considering how to bind together the world language system, a plural lingua franca regime is perhaps indeed, as Parijs argues, the worst solution to the problem, except for all the others.